Relax, said the night man. We are programmed to receive. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. Welcome to this week's Liverpool.com podcast. I am Dan Morgan, joined by David Lynch, Joel Rabinowitz and Matt Addison. In the aftermath of Liverpool and 11 other teams deciding they wanted to go and form a Super League, but then realising you needed to do more than just set up a website to do so. We are going to chat about everything Super League reaction from a Liverpool point of view. I mean, Dave, I'll just start with you. Just give us your reaction to the last few days, because we're at a point now where we've gone from the news breaking Sunday to John Henry posting a video this morning, giving a very public apology, something he very rarely does. And it feels now like we're all just left to sort of pick up the pieces of what's just happened over the last 72 hours.
Yeah, it's just been a whirlwind, hasn't it? And I think the thing I can't stop thinking about with all this is that this threat of a Super League has been going on for 20 years, and that's been the constant push to get more money out of UEFA relating to the Champions League. And then, for years people have been saying, haven't they, call the bluff, let them try it. It didn't even come to that. The clubs were arrogant enough to try it themselves, and then in the end, 48 hours it lasted, which is just embarrassing. You think that the billionaire owners of these clubs are intelligent people, and I think it's been proven completely, hasn't it, in the last 48 hours that they're not. They didn't have a depth to the plan. There wasn't, there was so many issues they hadn't worked out around it, and it just, it was a straw house really. It just got blown down. It's just absolutely embarrassing situation. I think the one positive to take from it, and I think it is a major positive, is that football fans in this country now have shown that they've got a united voice. If they can stick together on issues like this, you can fight this sort of stuff, and that is a fantastic lesson to learn, and something I hope gets taken forward from here, because there are still huge issues with football. But yeah, I think the overriding feeling is relief and happiness that it's been fought and shot down, really, and I just hope that's not the end of it either. I hope there's been talk of legislation in recent days, and I think that's an absolute must from here. I don't think we can stop here.
What did you hear about Liverpool's climb down?
It was obvious from yesterday morning when they were supposed to be having a sort of town hall meeting between the staff. That got cancelled bang on full time on Monday night after the Leeds United game, and I thought from that point it wouldn't happen, to be honest, because I just think that the moment that you start moving things like that around, and they were obviously in crisis mode, weren't they? And you were already hearing by that point as well rumours that Chelsea and City were having doubts. So I think from the moment they cancelled that meeting where we were planning to flesh out the plans to the staff, many of the staff, by the way, who had huge concerns about this, and I think Billy Hogan would have come under huge pressure at that meeting if he had taken questions, because most of the staff at Liverpool Football Club are huge fans of the club, and they completely agree with everyone else, and they had been blindsided as much as any supporter, as much as the manager, as much as the players. No one at Chapel Street, for example, had a clue about this or anything about it until it sort of happened. So it's purely the baby of the people who are based in Boston. And yeah, like I say, as soon as that call came in that the meeting was cancelled at full time against Leeds United, I thought this is the beginning of the end.
It's so staggering, Matt, isn't it? Just how little planning has gone into this. I mean, and we're seeing now a lot of sort of PR strategies being put in place from, particularly you can see around City and Chelsea, of how we were basically pressured into this because we were fearing missing out, and now, we were the first to pull out, so we deserve some credit. There'll be more of this posturing to come. But in all, I'm struggling to find any positives we can take from the last 48 hours. I completely take Dave's point in that we get to see the movement and the power of supporters yet again. But just from a point of view of where football goes now and moves forward, the manner in which this has been done, it does show you that those operating at the top are not as thought out and forthright as we can imagine sometimes.
Yeah, exactly that. I mean, Manchester City and Chelsea, just to touch on them, they don't get any credit in my book, and I don't think they will moving forward for being the first ones to pull out. They were as much a part of it as all of the others. I know Manchester United and Liverpool were kind of at the forefront of it with Real Madrid, but the other ones went along with it, Tottenham and Arsenal as well. None of these clubs, Arsenal have probably been the only one to put out a proper apology straight away, until obviously John Henry has this morning. But, even they, the remorse is almost hollow. The fact that they've done it in the first place, they've gone so far over the line, it's impossible to come back. And I think that's exactly the same with FSG. Now you wonder, you ask the question, what happens next? Well, what does happen next for FSG? I think the whole time they've gone so far over the line this time, the reputation is tarnished, the reputation is gone. It's beyond repair for me. I don't think Liverpool fans, whatever they do, whatever they say going forward, people will look back to this 48 hours and go, well, clearly you don't understand the fans, you don't understand the football club, the values of it, you don't understand what we want from it. Clearly, whatever they say is just completely irrelevant from now on for me. I don't think Liverpool fans have got that trust. I don't think that trust can be rebuilt. And I think that's probably the same for all of the clubs. I think, moving forward, the rest of the Premier League are going to look at these clubs in a certain way. Whatever they do, there's going to be immediate sort of skepticism as to why that is. And David used the word arrogance. I think that's absolutely spot on. I think there's no way that I believe that John Henry and people within FSG, I know he's put it all on his shoulders, which I think is important in itself. But whoever has made this decision, there's no way that they are stupid enough not to know what the reaction would be. To me, they've looked at it and thought the money is worthwhile, the reaction. And if we can get this through, it'll be worth all of the pain. Ultimately, and thankfully, they haven't managed to do that. But the fact that they even thought that it was worthwhile going through all this to force this through just underlines to me the fact that they are just either so stupid and so far out of touch, or they're so arrogant that they thought they could do it anyway. And, either one of those two possibilities is really not good for them moving forward. It's not good for what they've done. They've just completely and utterly ruined all of the good things that they've done at Liverpool, because, make no mistake, they've done a lot of good things. They've been here long enough that, they've won trophies. They've brought in Jurgen Klopp. For me, when we look back at FSG's time at Liverpool, this is what we're going to look back at and go, well, yeah, they did good stuff, but ultimately they've ruined it for themselves.
I mean, Joel, I think intention is a big thing here, and we're going to have to sort of dig deep into finding out what the intentions of each club were as this fallout continues. I was surprised to see the likes of Chelsea and City in there to begin with, to be honest. City, in particular now, given the economic state of football in the game, are a club who hold many cards, especially for the fact that they didn't have that Champions League ban upheld. They have a lot of power in the game already. You would imagine they were sold on the concept of more income and more economy, as most clubs would have been. But from a Liverpool point of view, transparency from FSG is one of the things that's been missing and one of the things that's been most frustrating. And I think it's in their best interests now to try and be transparent, or to be as transparent as they can about what their intentions were. Because I think, to defend them slightly for a second, I think some of their intentions are decent. I think they have a real problem with the lack of accountability around FFP, because they clearly abide by it and believe in it and set their stall to it. And then they see things like City's ban being overturned, and they feel like at times they're fighting a bit of a losing battle. I think they also have a problem around broadcast rights, which I think you can make a reasoned argument that they're right to have, because Liverpool can be flogged by name certain TV company one day and not have any sort of say in how they broadcast their own TV deals or their own revenues from the games that are shown. I guess where I'm going with this is, I think transparency now and setting out their intentions as to what they want, not only from Liverpool but from the future of football, is going to be massive. And if they just go mute again to the point in which they give another opinion down the line about something that, they haven't consulted fans on, or they haven't tried to delegate with fan supporters groups or anyone like that first, then they're going to just keep making the same mistakes and receiving the same backlash.
I mean, this is what, the fourth or fifth time that something like this has happened, but it feels like with the ticket prices and the furlough thing and the trademark whole fiasco, I think almost every time the magnitude of the error of judgment has got even bigger, and they've kind of underestimated the extent of the backlash even more every time. And I think what's different about this one, and what the guys are referring to in terms of it being almost impossible to see how they fully come back from it, is the fact that this time they've actually trampled on Klopp and the players. I think they've upset the fans massively before, and Klopp and the players haven't necessarily had to come out publicly and kind of condemn something. But the fact as well that I know it wouldn't have been entirely within FSG's control, obviously, when it was announced on Sunday night, but the fact that happened kind of less than 24 hours before Liverpool had what was a really important game, and as kind of that whole aspect has been completely overlooked, the fact that they could be sitting joint on points with Chelsea now, people have almost forgotten that because of what happened. But the disruption that caused, the fact that the manager himself, the players after the match, Milner had to go and do that interview, face the noise themselves, whilst FSG just basically hid and let it all kind of come crashing down on them. It's hugely unfortunate that Liverpool had to be the first club to play a game and be asked those questions after that news was announced. But yeah, in terms of the trust thing now, I mean, it's difficult because when I first saw the news, I couldn't believe the fact that I know what Matt mentioned there, that they kind of made a calculated choice, that they knew what the reaction would be and they thought that financially it was worth it. But I don't think they could have fully anticipated quite how strong it was and still gone ahead with it, because what is staggering is that they clearly aren't stupid people. They're quite intelligent businessmen who have got where they are and have had to make kind of big decisions in the past. So the fact that they have someone within their own ranks, the actual FSG president, Mike Gordon, is someone who has a close personal relationship with Klopp, speaks to him on a regular basis or so, you're told. It would have taken a phone call to know very, very quickly how this was going to go down. Klopp's even been on record, I think it was as recently as 2019, when he's asked about the Super League, saying that he is aggressively against the whole concept. So almost the information was out there before they even decided to go ahead with it. So I think that was, for me, the most shocking aspect, is that they've hired this coach who is arguably the most influential manager in Liverpool's history, definitely in their modern history. And they've backed him in the market to buy the players he wanted to buy. And he's kind of given them all this success, and that relationship specifically between Klopp and Gordon. But from everything you've read before, Klopp and FSG have a very close relationship. It's not like he's kind of outwardly spoken against the owners in the past. So the fact that they could do something that they knew would go so against the kind of the principles of the manager of the club, I think that for me is probably the most interesting aspect moving forward, especially kind of looking to the summer transfer market. Liverpool's squad, as we've spoken about on here countless times, is probably going to need quite a bit of, if not overhauling, then sort of pretty significant surgery this summer. And it's how they sort of square that with Klopp and the players. I think going forward, there were already kind of significant doubts within the fan base, but the fact that the actual kind of most significant people at the club in terms of the staff in Klopp and the squad themselves, the fact that they have felt so wronged by this, I think that relationship going forward is going to be quite difficult to mend.
I think, Dave, I think I'm so angry at the fact that there's a lot of people now who, let's have it right, were frankly panicked by this, and we're so scared by the prospect of this. And I'm talking football fans, everyday football fans like you or I here, that they very quickly yearned for a return to normality, a return to convention of what we know and what we've always known, because it was so threatened with being taken away. But let's not pretend that football was a bastion of fairness and was not without its problems beforehand. You know, I can reel off a number of things now which were massively problematic in football, and they are as recent as last week, when it was reported, I think by Miguel Delaney, that Boris Johnson had been asked to step in and overturn the Premier League to ensure that Newcastle could go through with the Saudi takeover. Now, you spoke before rightly about the whole country coming together in a manner in which we've not seen for, I would argue, greater social causes than this in recent times. But football and UEFA is massively problematic still. Manchester City will probably win a competition this season they should be banned from. The principal owner of a company that is the owner of Paris Saint-Germain is on the board at UEFA and owns the television company that has the chief rights to the Champions League. These are issues that, again, to put FSG aside for a moment, they need addressing. And my worry now is that everyone is so panicked by the prospect of a Super League because it was so flawed that we go back to the life we had without questioning the things that needed overturning, real sort of mediation and a process probably from government in terms of legislation to make football fairer and to make things like sports washing go away for good, because Liverpool have done what they've done over the past years, but let's have it right. It's the ultimate David and Goliath. They fought states and they fought brands such as City and PSG that people assumed were going to just dominate football for the next decade and beyond. And Liverpool were able to do it their way, but that was seen as a miracle. You know, equality in football, I guess what I'm getting at, is a long way off, even though this is now out the window.
Yeah, and I agree, and I hope this is a foundation to wider change in football. But I would also point out that, you know, there are issues with FFP in the sense that, you know, in its guise that basically got defeated by Manchester City, Liverpool simply become the Goliath then, don't they? They become the unbeatable side in terms of their financial might, and they would apply it probably more intelligently than, say, Manchester United. So there's a real chance that Liverpool would just become England's dominant team for as long until Manchester United sort themselves out, which I suppose most Liverpool fans will hope is a long way down the line. So, you know, I think what's important about what's gone on is that so many of the issues, particularly regarding the Champions League and the way that UEFA was running things, have been, you know, caused by the huge power that these clubs have in terms of lobbying because of this constant threat of a Super League. So that UEFA have had no backbone, no ability to stand up to these teams because they've been constantly scared that this Super League idea will happen. But now that's been proven to be a complete farce and unworkable completely. No desire from players, managers, fans, broadcasters even. A completely poisoned brand and for which the maths don't add up at all. I think that's a positive because that will allow UEFA, hopefully, and under huge fan pressure which needs to sustain, to actually govern the game in a way that's good for the game itself and to make changes if they feel like they need to. Because I think that the support is there and we can't let this go. And like I say, also again, the government pressure needs to be a huge sustained part of this. So if fans can stay united and keep the pressure on the governments to keep acting, then that is a huge part that will put pressure on UEFA as much as anyone else. As you know, the clubs have had their sort of telling off now, but I do think UEFA are due theirs and need to get their own house in order. But that's why every football fan needs to sustain this push and sort of say, okay, there needs to be legislation in England. We're talking about introducing the 50+1 rule. I think that's an absolute must as a starting point. And then you've got, you know, EU law about, you know, competition law, for example, in the case of this idea that the new Champions League format will have a guaranteed position for two clubs who've had a certain coefficient. I think that's absolute nonsense and we must push back as hard as possible against that. So I think it's all about every football fan remembering that this is not the end of the battle. This is just the start. There are so many issues there that still need resolving. But I completely understand why UEFA would put up as the good guys against the idea that was being put forward. You just can't allow that idea to cement itself now because UEFA are definitely not the good guys. I don't think anyone in football governance can be regarded in that light. And fans need to stick together and sort of keep pushing change through.
Yeah, I mean, Matt, we come back to Liverpool again, and you know, the idea was basically flawed from the start because it took away the concept of merit. And this season is a classic example that Liverpool, in one way or another, will end up getting what they deserve from the season. They will end up getting their rewards or their punishments, if you like, from what has happened through this season. And everyone will have to take their medicine. And yeah, we can argue about injuries and so on and so forth. But if Liverpool finish outside the top four, it will be because it will be seen as though they've not done enough to get in the top four, and it will be seen as though someone else has done more than them to earn that place. And everyone will take that particular pill, and will try and rebuild and go again. You couldn't have a system where you would not be punished for your ineptitude domestically, and B, you couldn't have this in place and expect reasonably domestic leagues to survive. They wouldn't have done. You could not have had one without the other. And then going back to the whole conversation that we've had so far, you wonder how they thought this could ever work or get through or be accepted by the general public. It seems like a mass underappreciation of people's common sense, basically.
Yeah, the very definition of sport is that it is competitive and that it matters, and that's why the Premier League has been, at the forefront of football in terms of revenues, which ultimately is what these clubs are bothered about. The reason that people tune in and they watch these games is because there is a chance that Sheffield United could go to Manchester United and win. If you've got no consequence for that happening, if there's no reason to turn on and watch these games, well, I think ultimately people won't. I mean, the argument would be from these clubs that the audience is just so huge that if you lose a few of the hardcore fans, it doesn't necessarily matter. They're just sort of numbers on a spreadsheet, and that is the case. Of course, that is the case fundamentally. If they've done the numbers, they've done the maths, and they've worked out that is the case, then absolutely fine. But fans are more than just numbers on a spreadsheet. And I think, fans, obviously, the reaction to this was obvious. If you take away, the consequence of these games, suddenly everything becomes meaningless. And I think that the Big Six, certainly in England, knew that this was the case. They knew this is why they thought they could push it through. They knew that the Premier League, for example, would just fall apart if they're not there, if they remove themselves from it. Well, if you've got Everton and Aston Villa and Leeds and all of these teams, they're obviously big teams. They've got big followings. They've got, people in different parts of the world that support them. But it's a very, very small percentage compared to the Big Six. And that's where this greed came from. They saw an opportunity. They saw a chance to do all of this, regardless of what impact that would have on the rest of football, what impact that would have on the competitiveness of the league. And you just keep coming back to it. It's just so blindingly obvious that this would never have worked because of that. I think, short term, a Super League could have worked because, people would get excited initially, certainly of the people who support the bigger teams. I'm sure a lot of people could get on board with the idea that Liverpool play, Real Madrid and Barcelona and these teams. But after 2 or 3 years, it just goes to become normal. It becomes something that you just get used to. And it's just like, oh, yeah, got Barcelona away this week. Whereas that should be something that happens once every 4 or 5 years or 10 years or whatever it's been for Liverpool. And that's where the competitiveness of this comes in again. It's not a competitive game if there's no consequence. It's not a competitive game if you're playing the same teams year in, year out. And yeah, fundamentally, it was just a flawed idea from the start from that. But the arrogance of the team suggested that they could just about squeeze it through.
Can I just come in on that point, actually? What Matt makes it's very interesting about the fans in the ground probably being considered less valuable in terms of revenue they can generate. And I think you're absolutely right in that is what they thought, which I think speaks to a fundamental misunderstanding of the product, in that supporters, even the ones who never attend Anfield, for example, are completely buying into the idea of that is part of the product, the fans and the atmosphere, particularly for Liverpool. The whole brand is built around it.
The club marketing,
yeah, absolutely. And they believe that brand could sustain even if you were getting lesser attendances because people were sick of it or the prices were too much. They don't believe that that's part of the product that they're selling, even though so heavily lean on it in the marketing. And I find that incredible. And again, like you say about the jeopardy of the games, is that half of the Super League games would have ended up being meaningless. And there's a reason that, for example, the ICC pre-season friendly tournament, the television rights to that are not lucrative. Even though it's Liverpool against Manchester United in Miami, or Real Madrid against Inter or whatever, the reason the TV rights aren't lucrative is because there's nothing riding on the games and no one cares to watch them for that reason. So the idea that they could pay these billions of pounds back to JP Morgan in that loan in television rights is just completely misplaced.
Even the pre-season friendlies, I mean, I'm sure they'll point to, was it Michigan where Liverpool played a couple of seasons ago? They sell out 90 or 100,000, but even that is a rare event in itself. Yeah. Would you get 90 to 100,000 people if that was happening twice a week? I don't think you would. I think the very fact that it is once a year or once every 2 or 3 years that Liverpool go to America, that's the whole point, isn't it? It's a rare event. You have to buy your ticket for that match. Otherwise, there's no other opportunity to do it.
Sorry, Dan, just to add on that as well. If you look at like this season, for example, if you go to the parallel kind of reality where the Super League was already a thing, if you look at what the Premier League would be now, basically, I mean, I don't even know where Arsenal are now, but they're somewhere near mid-table. But you basically would have teams like Leicester and West Ham, their existence would basically be worthless because the players that have kind of done well and got them into that position where they've got a realistic chance of finishing in the top 4, it would essentially be a competition for them just to basically jump up to a Super League club, and that's it. And then it would just repeat the cycle year after year. The best players from all the clubs, Leicester, West Ham are the obvious ones this season, but also Everton. I don't know who the next ones will be, but we've obviously had Wolves and Sheffield United in recent years who've kind of managed to kind of break through that ceiling, which for so long has seemed difficult, but is now kind of becoming increasingly regular. Every season we're getting 1 or 2 clubs minimum who are sort of threatening to break the Big Six is more of an idea or a concept based on kind of global popularity and heritage than actual kind of current sporting achievement. I mean, I don't know how many seasons it is, again, that Arsenal have been out of the Champions League, just to pick on them as one example, but there will be examples in years to come where at least one of the current or so-called Big Six will kind of drop out for a while. And the fact that can't be kind of, like you say, punishable in real sporting terms just is a nonsense, because then you'd be watching games at this point of the season where, again, it all becomes about transfers, because the players, say, take Jack Grealish, for example, who's obviously had a great season at Aston Villa. His entire objective wouldn't be to try and get his club into Europe. It would just be to try and get a move to one of the Super League clubs. And that would be basically the entire point of nearly every club apart from the Big Six in the Premier League. So, yeah, from the start, really, it never had any sort of legs to go from.
Dave, what did you make of the apology? Because I found it very interesting. There was a lot of use of the phrase "your club" from John Henry, and what struck to me, I think Neil Atkinson wrote it this morning on his Anfield Wrap email, was that Liverpool exists in 3 places. It exists in Boston, it exists in Liverpool, and it exists in London. And the disparity between those 3 places and the events of the last 48 hours has been abundantly clear that what has happened has basically evolved from Boston. And I think that John Henry is in many ways, with that video, decided to become the sacrificial lamb, and decided that he needs positive energies focused towards the day-to-day run of the club, the manager, the team, and he's happy to be the villain of the piece, which people will be happy to make him in that sense, because he's obviously done something deemed to be wrong. But I found it a really interesting use of words. I found it opens up the door to just how separated Liverpool can be at times, and we've spoken about it in the fact that, you know, a lot of these staff members, a lot of the team, a lot of the squad, a lot of the coaching staff weren't aware of what was going on until they were preparing for the game against Leeds, and you almost find that impossible to believe that this club isn't so intertwined and ingrained in itself that something like that could happen, but it does, and it has. And it's a lesson to us in many ways that this is a club that exists in many places.
Yeah, and I think, well, for starters, the apology would have had a more profound impact if it wasn't what are we on, 6 or 7 apologies from FSG now since they took over, probably more than that. I think at this point, I don't believe that there is any sort of genuine remorse involved in it whatsoever. I think John Henry deserves no credit really for putting himself forward to do that, because he is the architect of this idea. It is all his fault. If you'd put someone forward like Billy Hogan to fall on his sword in his place, I think that would have reflected horribly on him, because we know that this is the brainchild of the people in Boston rather than anyone who's sort of involved in the day-to-day running of the club. And I think what was interesting about it was there's no mention of what is going to change off the back of this. This is the 10th mistake we've made, therefore we're going to do this, and this. So are we just basically to assume that, okay, that apology's there, we all register that, thanks very much, and now we just continue as normal until the next gaffe happens, which is inevitable given the way that the club is run. I just don't think it's good enough at all. And I think it was touched on earlier that Jurgen Klopp and Mike Gordon are supposed to be in constant communication. So clearly they don't speak enough, because there is such a fundamental misunderstanding between the two about what football is and what football should represent, and that Jurgen was not looped in on even the very idea of this before it was publicly announced as the future of football. Just says there's a huge problem there, and I just think that the apology will receive no credit, rightly so, and I think there's no promise to changes, and therefore I think Liverpool supporters should consider this the start of the end for FSG, if that is possible. I know the vast sums of money involved in the game and the valuation that's put on Liverpool would make that extremely difficult, and I suppose it's better the devil you know in terms of who might come in to replace FSG, but I just don't think that apology is worth anything, and I don't believe there's any change coming or that any lessons have been learned, because they haven't been learned before. So it's meaningless.
Also, apart from kind of the words he used, the fact that it came out, what was it, like 9.5 hours after the official statement is kind of telling. It's almost like they kind of they put out, what was it, 47 words in the statement, which didn't say sorry, didn't even acknowledge that it was a mistake, just said that they'd use some really businessy language to basically say they'd had some input from some stakeholders and had decided to withdraw. But they didn't say, it wasn't like the Arsenal one where they basically said we've made a screw up here and we're really sorry for it. It wasn't nothing. And then obviously they got a big backlash from that. I think that's why you get the video. He's probably seen it and gone, I need to actually say something, because his name hadn't even appeared on the club's website in the entire thing when Man United's owner had. So I think, I don't really take it for very much.
I mean, is it the better the devil you know, Joel? I mean, you're writing a piece today on the Liverpool.com site about what we actually want from owners and what that would constitute if FSG were to step aside. It's a different landscape now to 2010, as Dave says, when Fenway acquired Liverpool, in a high court, and they got an absolute steal for the club. Liverpool is valued at over £1 billion. Who buys Liverpool? What is it we want from an owner? Who can we reasonably expect to come into the club? Do we look at more of a fan model? Is that not without problems? There's tons of questions around this now in terms of what we do moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I completely understand and agree with the sentiment that it's kind of coming to an end of the road for FSG in terms of being able to repair the trust that they've severed. The issue is then when you look to who realistically could afford to buy, I don't know how the actual numbers of what Liverpool are worth now, but it's a very limited number of the types of people or organisations that could buy Liverpool, and there's no guarantees that you're getting someone who's going to be better or have the club's or the city's interests more at heart than FSG. I think to go back to the 50+1 thing that Dave mentioned earlier, I think I've been a bit of a look into that this morning, but from my understanding, that's not to say that the fans would own more than 50% of a club, is that they'd have more than 50% of the voting rights in key decisions. So I still think you could have kind of a different ownership or very rich ownership who could afford the club, but fans actually still get a say, even if they don't have a financial stake. I think that's what that refers to. If that's the case, then massively, that probably needs to be the route they go down. I think, just to ponder FSG's position in a wider sense, what's so difficult to kind of come to terms with in the last 2-3 days is that, yes, he had a significant kind of proportion of supporters up until now who had significant doubts because of the previous mistakes they've made and the backtracking they've had to do. But as kind of Matt mentioned earlier, the amount of good things they've done, i.e. recruiting a manager like Klopp, winning basically the biggest club honours in football, they've obviously built the main stands, the new training complexes, all these things that when you set out when they first arrived in 2010, what would you want to see them do in the next 10 years? I think most of those things they've kind of ticked off the list, and yet they've somehow managed to unravel all of that goodwill that existed in the space of 2 or 3 days for something that they could have completely foreseen but chose to do anyway. It is just kind of staggering. It will be interesting just in sort of, I would be surprised if they're still at the club in a few years' time, but in say 5 to 10 years down the line, how we all kind of look back on their entire reign will be a really fascinating one, because they, as I said, they have kind of delivered on pretty much all the objectives that you would set out for owners. I think that going forward, and I don't know who Liverpool's next owners or what the kind of type of owners could be, but in the main thing, number one thing above all else is consultation and listening. You don't expect them to come in and get everything right or know everything about the sport and the city, but what you want, and I think what has frustrated people so much about FSG, is just a sense that they have their heads kind of in a different world where they just don't listen. And even though they've got people on the ground in Liverpool who they could just speak to and pick up the phone and get a sense of what people's kind of general opinion is on a matter, they just press ahead with their own kind of motives and their own desires and kind of let everything burn around it. And I think that's, for any future ownership, has to be the number one thing, is kind of keeping the communication lines open and consulting before kind of going ahead and making such big decisions.
I don't think they're going anywhere, to be honest with you. The venture capitalists, they are more than John Henry and Tom Werner. They're a massive group. I think the Redbird thing, Matt, you'll know a lot more about that. I think shows that they're willing to welcome additional investments, but I think they will. I'd be staggered if they tried to sell the club on the back of this, because I think they've got the valuation more than 3 or 4 times what it's worth, and they see this as something that is the future of probably their own group. That's my own personal opinion. But on that, Matt, we're now talking about the future. We've got the likes of SOS who are asking them to consider their position at Liverpool. There's potential that this starts to get a bit Hicks and Gillette ugly, in my opinion, in that protests and active rebellion against the owners becomes a viable thing from supporters. That is well within people's rights if they believe that's what they want to do and they feel aggrieved enough. What I would say is that is not an environment conducive to what Jurgen Klopp needs to harness success at a football club. And we've seen that time and again. He's a manager and a man that Liverpool needs at the helm in situations like this. And time and again, he comes out and he backs the owners and he tells us that they're decent people with decent intentions and that they're not people who he feels like he cannot work with. And guess what I'm asking is, what do we do now for the sake of the team, for the sake of the manager, for the sake of getting Liverpool back to where we want them to be on the pitch? What do we do? How do we balance this with the ineptitude shown from the owners and our obvious displeasure at events in the last 48 hours? It's a really difficult one to gauge.
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult one to sort of put a position on it, to be honest. I think first and foremost, we should say it's no coincidence that they come out with these plans at a time when fans are not in the ground. I don't think it would have been something they'd have had the nerve to attempt had fans been in the stadium, because the protests, I'd be surprised if the Leeds game even got played, to be honest. If fans were in the ground, I think there would be such a mess created around it if they'd have tried that. I don't think it would have even happened. So it's going to be fascinating to see what sort of happens, not just with Liverpool, but obviously we focus specifically on them, moving forward with this. I think there's going to be, as you say, a lot of kind of anger. I know obviously Jurgen Klopp and James Milner both spoke on Monday about, feeling that Leeds fans had sort of targeted them with the abuse because, it's obviously nothing to do with them. It wasn't their decision. But I think you'd rather that they targeted the players in that sort of instance, because they couldn't have targeted the owners. The owners were nowhere to be seen. They had to put on some sort of protest to stop this. And ultimately, the only sort of symbol of Liverpool Football Club that was available to protest against was the players and was the manager. So I think that sort of thing is going to continue, obviously, not in terms of protesting this, but in terms of what happens next. I think in terms of FSG at Liverpool, you're spot on. Joel's spot on as well, though, that, if we say that it's untenable, they can't continue, well, who comes in their place? That's the difficult thing. I think there's no sort of indication that they would want to move on. They've only just got this $700 million investment. They've sort of gone down that route, I think, partly with the Super League in mind. It'd be interesting to see what happens with that next. I know, Jerry Cardinal, who was very influential in that, is very influential in terms of TV deals, in terms of selling pay-per-view media sort of packages and things like that, going down very much that American model. At this stage, it is just too soon to sort of see what the knock-on effect of that deal is. But I think that the one thing that we can say for sure right now is that they've no intentions of selling Liverpool and moving on. I think the only way that would get forced upon them is if the reaction, once fans are back, once fan groups, pull themselves into a position of being able to lobby against these things. I think I can foresee a situation where maybe they start to actively think maybe, this isn't for us, because it's just got to such a vociferous situation that they can't continue. But I think we're still a few months away from that happening.
That's why, for me, the 50+1 voting rights rule should be the focus of all Liverpool supporters from now on, really, in terms of any protests and things like that. Because, like you say, the manager and the players don't deserve to get this negative impact. I don't think it's possibly the right way to communicate it, because I think it would just negatively affect the team, which no supporter wants. And again, they were absolutely nothing to do with this. So I think. And like we said about, you don't know who would be the owners that come in to replace FSG. It could be anyone. It could be someone who doesn't have the club's best interests at heart. You could end up with another Hicks and Gillette situation. So the only thing that would guard against that, and guard against no matter who takes over the club, would have to act in the club's best interest, is that 50+1 rule. That basically guards you against any problems going forward with your ownership for the remainder of time. So I think that should really be the focus of supporters, is pushing the government and coordinating protests around that and really lobbying the government to bring that rule in, because I think that's the only thing that you could say then confidently going forward, is that fans will always have a say then, and we won't end up in a situation where anything like this could even remotely get off the ground, as we've seen that the two German clubs weren't anywhere near this Super League proposal. And I think there might be some greedy people at the top of those clubs, but they weren't allowed to act in those interests because they knew that they couldn't, and I think that's the situation we need to get English football into, and that should be the main priority.
Yeah, I mean, just on a final note, Dave, the press conference on Friday for Jurgen Klopp, I think it is, he's going to keep fielding these questions. He's going to have to keep giving answers on them. You back that he will be genuine, you back that he will say the right things, and you back that he will act within the best interests of his team. I guess where the final question I'm going to ask is like I asked Matt, where do the fans now sit in this? There was talk that flags and banners would be removed from the Kop. Will they go back on? It is important that the fans show that, obviously, we know this. They're not making an enemy of the team and the manager. That they're still behind them, that they still support them first and foremost. And, yeah, making that the priority, but also, getting that differential between that and their anger towards the owners is a difficult thing, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think the banners should go back. Like I said, I think it will be counterproductive for supporters to continue directing their ire towards the players and managers who couldn't have done more, really, could they, in terms of pushing against it themselves. I think, Klopp's interviews over after the Leeds, before and after the Leeds game were spot on. He made quite clear that he had no interest in it. What James Milner said, then the players' collective statement. So anything that sort of damages them in any way, I think would be extremely unfair. And I hope there's sort of sense seen on that, and that the banners do get put back, because that's probably not the best way to get at the owners. They don't, they are removed from all that. So, like I said, really, I think the main focus, and I would like to see fan groups all coming together is to campaign the government and make sure that legislation is brought in, because I think anything else will just have a bad effect on the team, and that's absolutely not what any fan wants, and not what the players and the manager deserve.
Okay, that's been this week's Liverpool.com podcast. There's not been a lot to talk about, so we do apologise, but we'll have to go with what we have, which has been a slow news week, unfortunately. Huge thanks to Dave, to Joel, and to Matt. We'll see you next time. Take care.